In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Good Heavens is a podcast that takes a deep look into the cosmos, revealing God's wondrous power and design.
Psalm 33, verses 6 through 9 say, quote, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their hosts. He gathers the waters of the seas together as a heap. He lays up the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." End quote. And in Psalm 89, we read that King David's throne is as the sun before the Lord, and, quote, "It shall be established forever, like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful." End quote. The witness in the sky, the sun, moon, stars, and the innumerable galactic hosts all declare the glory of God, showing forth his workmanship and his attributes of faithfulness, goodness, wisdom, and power. As Colossians says, the Lord Jesus is the reason for why the heavens and the earth exist. Quote, "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by him and for him." End quote. On this special episode of Good Heavens, we talk with Answers in Genesis astronomer Dr. Danny Faulkner about his latest book, The Heavens, A Different View. It is a beautiful collaborative effort between Danny and two backyard astrophotographers Glen and Jim Bonser. Together they have put together a stunning visual tour of the heavens as seen through their backyard telescopes. If you're watching this on video, there is also an audio podcast version available. See the link to the podcast audio in the notes section below this video. We hope you enjoy it. I have a coffee table book of Hubble images that was signed by, I met Dr. Anton Kokomower, who was a Hubble guy who put together the deep field pictures. And so he signed his deep field picture in my Hubble book. So that's my treasure. but you know, this does bring us to the very real and obvious fact that the kind of astronomy that you do, Danny, is visual. And there seems to be in the sciences today like a disconnect between like visual astronomy, what Jim and Glen and you do, and theoretical cosmology and theoretical physics, where a lot of the sciences of the heavens are discoursing in things that are unseen. But I love practical astronomy and what you do and appreciate this kind of work because astronomy has always been, first and foremost, a visual discipline.
I think that's what hooked me starting out. The wonder of the pictures, the images, and then the scale of things. And pictures do a good job on that one. But you're right. I think a lot of the science today is so disconnected from the pictures anymore that it's difficult to bridge the two together.
Right. And we're also struggling with, this is a problem, light pollution in the neighborhoods where we live. I mean, here in Arlington, when I walk out of my office at night, I'm right smack in the middle of Arlington, and you can't see but a handful of stars. And if I didn't know the direction in which I was looking, I would not be able to identify anything. You can barely see on a clear night here in Arlington, in the middle of the city, you can barely see Orion, the most prominent constellation at this time of year in the northern hemisphere. And I thought we'd maybe talk about. Let's start with what we can see without telescopes. Okay. And, because this will be helpful to get people to go out in their backyard or to go out somewhere and to give them a marker, to give them a place to start. That's Orion. That's the constellation of Orion. And there's so many stories and myths attached to it, but it is such a beautiful arrangement. I mean, it is admittedly my favorite. Orion, Taurus, and the Pleiades with Betelgeuse and Aldebaran and Atlas and his daughters, the Pleiades, the star cluster. Let's talk about that. You have some visually stunning images in the book from Jim and Glen about Orion. Talk a little bit about, maybe we can go into the sciences. What are the stars in there, and maybe go into a little bit of the sciences, and then we can talk a little bit about the myths and the fact that it's mentioned in Scripture 3 times, I think it is, in Amos 5:8, Job 9:9, and I think it's in Job 38:31. So let's talk about Orion. On page 31, you have Orion and the Pleiades and other groups of stars, and this is a favorite target of astronomer photographers because of some of the wonderful things that you can find in Orion.
Yeah, Orion is one of my 2 favorite constellations. I was attracted to it at high school a half century ago. It's big, it's bright. It actually resembles what it's supposed to look like.
It does, right. Right. A man.
Some people can't pick it out, and if that's the case, then I have no hope for them seeing any of it. But I have a good imagination. It's not hard at all.
Right.
And the Orion Nebula there in the sword, you can kind of see it in that one photograph that the whole constellation. It shows up better in some of the others, of course.
Yeah. Now the nebula, you have the 3 stars of Mintaka, Alnilam, and Alnitak, right, which are the girdle and the pearl. And then below that, you have what seems like 3 other stars, but that middle star is not a star. It is a nebulae. It's a nebula. And explain a little bit what a nebula is.
Well, it comes from I think it's the Latin word for cloud.
Yeah.
And it's literally a cloud of gas and dust, perhaps, in space. So it's well named. Some of the other things turned out not to be nebulae, turned out to be galaxies or star clusters.
Mm-hmm.
But the Orion Nebula is fired up by 4 stars at the center called the trapezium, and they provide the energy ionizing that hydrogen gas. The trapezium is actually photographed I think on page 43, and also
it's
in 41
beautiful.
You can see it as well. There are 4 stars close together.
Yes.
And this is my second favorite thing to look at through the telescope. My first favorite, of course, is Saturn.
Yeah.
But this is my second favorite thing, and it's bright. Even in light polluted skies, you can, with a good-sized telescope, you can see quite a bit of the nebula. And to me, I can see a little color. The photographs typically are red because they have a lot of hydrogen emission, gas emission, in the red part of the spectrum. But our eyes don't pick up red very well at all. Our pink sensitivity is in the green part of the spectrum. So most people kind of see it white. But and I never can figure this out, but on some nights with a moderate-sized telescope, I see this iridescent green color in the Orion Nebula, and my eyes are picking up a couple of forbidden nitrogen and oxygen lines smack in the middle, emission lines in the middle of the visible part of the spectrum. And I think maybe my green cones are a little more sensitive than most. I see green frequently enough in astronomy things, which things aren't green. So I'm seeing, some really interesting physiological things going on in my eyeballs. But
so the nebula, this nebula, correct me if I'm wrong, it is the only one or one of a handful that you can, I think it's the only one you can see with the naked eye if you're in a good dark sky, correct?
Yeah, you can see the Andromeda Galaxy with the naked eye. That's a galaxy. Yeah. But any other nebulae, I'm not aware of any that you can readily see with the naked eye. If you can, it's going to be like a really fuzzy little dot, very, very barely visible, very faint. This is actually quite bright, and it looks good with binoculars. It looks good at a small telescope, a big telescope. It really doesn't disappoint like so many things do. And you see some of the structure there when you look at it with the eye on page 43. That's pretty a lot what I see, except for the color difference.
Yeah, that's what I see in my telescope. I have
and it's very
I have a 10-inch Dobsonian that I look.
There you go.
I don't do astrophotography, but minus the purplish and red colors that you see there, I do see the trapezium very clearly. Now, the trapezium, the 4 stars in my telescope, they look blue. They just look like blue diamonds.
Yeah,
and
they will look blue to the eye. And you see a lot of structure there too. To me, the bright part there looks like a couple of wings to me, to my eye visually. And you see a lot of structure with dark and light shading, and those are caused by knots of dust clouds within the nebula. So it's a fascinating thing to look at. You can spend a lot of time looking at it.
Absolutely.
Do you ever see any green, by the way, when you look at it?
I'd have, you've got me. That's my assignment now tonight. When I go out, I'm going to have to look at and see if I can notice the green. I think I will.
Yeah.
It's
just subtle sometimes. Sometimes to me, it just blows my eyes out.
I wonder how much atmospheric interference we're talking about that adds to the color of maybe jet trails might be doing it, or
I don't always see it. That's the weird thing, and color sensitivity is tricky in dim light, so I've never been able to figure out the trick of what you need: aperture, darkness, no moon versus a little bit of moon, or what.
Hard to recreate it.
Yeah,
but I think this, in terms of the technical aspect of what's going on with the Orion Nebula, the trapezium, those 4 stars, I think this is just one aspect of why, you hear it in astronomy from secular astronomers a lot, that our sun is ordinary. But that is such a cliche. It's not, because here in the trapezium, you have, I would imagine, this collection of 4 stars, these things are super active, powerful, and they're stripping electrons off of the gas in the surrounding cloud. These things are spewing energy and creating this mess. I mean, I would think if our sun was as violent, I say violent, or as active, in a better word, that our solar system could be engulfed in gas and hydrogen stripping, brightness and luminosity and power. These trapezium stars are very active, aren't they? And compared to our sun,
the key is their temperature and brightness. These are probably B-type stars. They're very hot. Their temperature is in excess of 10,000 Kelvin. I'd have to look up the exact.
So double what our sun would be almost
easily. And you got a lot of UV radiation, and the UV radiation is what's ionizing that hydrogen gas. Keep in mind, it's also a gassy environment. Now, the evolutionists would say this is because it's a stellar nursery. I'd beg to differ with that, but it is a more gassy location than we're in. We don't have a lot of free hydrogen floating around like you do on the Orion Nebula.
Right.
So it's the environment, but it's also the hot bright stars. If they were white dwarfs, they wouldn't be bright enough. They'd be hot enough, but not bright enough. And if you had a large, like a subgiant or giant star, it would be bright enough, but not hot enough. You need copious amounts of UV radiation.
Gotcha.
That stars in excess of 10,000 Kelvin can do this.
Well, and that's that gaseous environment, I think also, and I would assume, is also what Jim or Glen has captured in the photo of the Pleiades. With their hot white blue stars, which you have that super luminous, intense brightness that is contributing to illuminating the gas around some of these stars.
Yeah, you're seeing this on pages 31 and
31, correct.
2. And there's something a little different going on here. It's not a very gaseous environment. It is a dusty environment. It's that little blue stuff you see. That is nebulosity. It's light scattering off of dust particles.
Okay, so it's not gas, it's dust.
It's dust primarily. And
Gotcha.
Whenever you look at these pictures of nebulae and you see blue, it's usually indicative of dust. When you see red, it's indicative of gas, which is dominated by hydrogen. So you're seeing, in one case, Orion Nebula emission of gas. In the case of the Pleiades, dust clouds around some of the brighter stars, and they're kicking up. Now, those are like A-type stars. Their temperatures are around 10,000 Kelvin, as I recall, on those. So they're a little different process going on there. And I believe in the essay, I do talk about the two of them together. If you turn to page 44 and 45, you will see a rendition there of a Horsehead Nebula by Glen Fountain.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That is absolutely
by the
beautiful.
way, I've got he put a nice he gave me this when he was at the museum a few years ago. He did this. Can you see it? It's on metal. It's
gorgeous.
and it's got a little stand on it. So it's a beautiful piece of artwork that he gave me as a gift, and I really appreciate it.
That
keep
is
it on
awesome.
display in my office here.
I want one of those. Give me Jim's contact. I'll buy one.
Yeah. I'll see what I can do for you.
Well,
but I was going to say there's several things going on here. The red nebulosity you see across the top, that is due to hydrogen emission.
Yes.
And then towards the lower left, particularly on page 45, you can see that blue glow. You've got at least one star, maybe a couple others that are just barely inside of a big wall of dust.
Mm-hmm.
And that is starlight scattering off the dust particles. These are called reflection nebulae rather than emission nebulae. That's that blue color giving it away.
Okay.
And then the third part of the thing I need to point out is that the lower half of this image is this big wall of dust, which doesn't really go the upper half at all. And there's a little appendage of it sticking up that's got that peculiar horsehead shape.
Yes.
And that's if you get enough dust, what it does is it blocks the light of more distant stars. You'll notice inside that silhouette of the horse head, you don't see any stars at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then look at the density of stars across the bottom half where it's dark, and across the top half, and you can see the top half, there are far more stars.
Yeah.
And that's because the lower half, that wall of dust is so thick that you're not really seeing any stars beyond it. All the stars you see are this side of that wall, but above it, you're seeing stars that are this side and beyond it as well.
Okay.
So there's a lot of neat little physics you can kind of tweak out of this too, just by looking at the pictures.
That's fascinating.
The colors tell you a lot, and the darkness tells you a lot.
Well, we have two things going on in your book, and I appreciate the way you've articulated two things simultaneously. Oftentimes, as you know, in secular science, you study all this stuff: hydrogen, gas, dust, the mechanics of stars, and what's going on in the kinds of stars. And this is all fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But in secular science, it kind of stops there. And you look at the magnitude and the wonder and the multiplicity of all of these things: the gas, the dust, the sheer beauty of what we're looking at. And science doesn't even begin to address questions of why it's here. Or of meaning or of purpose. Or, it's just, let's study the gas, let's find the science, let's get down to the core of the nuclear fusion and whatever else is going on. But your book does a great job of combining what we know of science, the visual, stunning imagery of the universe, and ultimately why it's all here, Danny. And I thought we could take a little theological excursion about Orion and the Pleiades. In Job, I want to talk a little bit about God's question to Job, and I think this brings home what the universe is all about. Of course, in Colossians, we read that, by him all things were created, by him and for him all things were created, speaking of Jesus. But God asks Job, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? And you have a little excerpt in the book. I don't have the page number, but you have a little excerpt in the book about the intrigue that kind of surrounds what does God mean by binding and loosing?
That's on page 34, I believe.
34. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a fascinating question. I want to. So the theology of what this is. What do you think is going on there in God's question to Job?
Well, it's tricky, and dealing with Job particularly, it's a very old book of the Bible. It's got a lot of poetry in it. It is a poetic book. It's got a lot of imagery that. I've talked to some Hebrew people, and they tell me there's a lot of language that's unique to Job.
That's right.
So we got to be very careful. But there's something very interesting. The chords of the bands of Orion. Some people think that might be referring to the belt, and those three stars are moving together through space. We can measure what we call proper motion of stars. They make very precise measurements, usually in photographs now. And then they come back decades later and do it again, and then compare the position changes. Not much, but you can measure it. And from that, you can actually project into the past and future where these have been and where they will be. And the Pleiades is a star cluster that's gravitationally bound together. And so we do an interesting thing here at the planetarium. We have a Stargazer night. We do usually on Friday nights, April through October during first quarter moon, and we have staff that's involved with it. And so we really can't do a rain date on any of this. We people sign up, and then if it's cloudy, we do an alternate program. And I do a live show inside. We do a Q&A sort of thing. We do all sorts of fun things. We do things normally we don't do in the planetarium. We've got a very powerful planetarium projector here. And then we'll call it the grand finale. And one of our staff members, she's really good at this. She's got a little script she works from. And she reads this verse about Job, talking about the Pleiades and the bands of Orion being bound. And what we can do is we can take the motions of all these stars in the sky, and with the information we have about them, we can project where they will be in 1,000,000 years. And so they just run this forward and for your very eyes, and they say we light up, we put a line connecting the 3 belt stars, we put the little lines connecting the 3 Pleiades stars, or the several Pleiades stars. And we run this over about 30 seconds, run it through 1,000,000 years into the future. And stars are zipping all over the sky. And as you do this, the only 2 things that maintain their identity over this time are the belt stars of Orion and the Pleiades.
Wow, they stay together.
They move a little bit in the sky, but that shape changes a little bit. And then they ask people, well, when they get done, do you recognize any of the constellations? And of course, nobody says no. She said, well, maybe we put the little lines up in the sky to help you out. And of course, when they do it, the lines are a huge mess, like an explosion.
Can't see them anymore.
Yeah. Everybody laughs at that point because it's pretty obvious. And then we reverse it and bring us back. And as you do, those lines converge back to constellations. But through it all, only 2 things remain fixed. And I find that interesting, that the 2 things that remain fixed are actually mentioned in Job as being something that's held together.
Wow.
Can you find them like I have? So it's very powerful. If you come to visit sometime, I'll try to take a planetarium. We'll show you that.
That's awesome.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try to make that happen. And what you're saying here, I pulled out my commentary on Job. This one is from the New International Commentary series on the Old Testament. It's a pretty good series. John Hartley is the commentator on Job. He says this. He says that in the ancient way of thinking, stars were believed to be controlled by chains. And each day God loosened their cords so that they could make their journey across the sky. And perhaps he suggests that the terms bind and loose in relation to the stars is preferable. He takes these terms to mean that when a constellation rises, it is harnessed to its course, and when it's set, the harness is loosed. So it's like kite flying in a sense. That he thinks that maybe that there's some binding and loosing. But it got me to do a little digging for this question in particular, because if we do the principle of Scripture interpreting Scripture, we have a couple of things that I thought, I don't know how related they are. I'm not an Old Testament theologian, but in Samson's brief life in Judges 14 through 16, there are multiple references to Samson being bound. Delilah, how do I bind you? How do I do this? Mm-hmm. And he breaks the cords when the Philistines try to tie him up. He snaps the cords. And I thought, well, I don't think Job is referring to Samson, because I think Job probably comes way before Samson. But then I thought of Jesus in Matthew 16, where he tells Peter, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And he says to Peter, I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom of the heavens. And in the Greek, it is plural, ton oranon, I think is what it is there in that passage. And so I wonder, through Christ, we are able to answer God. God's answer, he answers himself, right? He asks the question, can you do this, Job? No, you can't. But if I give you the keys to the kingdom in a spiritual sense, you can bind and loose. And I don't know if there's any immediate connection to that or not, but what you say here is fascinating to me, because you also point out in the book, and I wore my Pleiades hat today. I have a Subaru, and so you mentioned Subaru in your book, and it's interesting too. In Japan, as you point out, the Subaru cluster means the Subaru is the word for the cluster. It means unity. So you have, even in a Japanese culture that is not steeped in the Judeo-Christian West, you have this idea in that small cluster of stars of unity, of sticking together. That's fascinating.
Yeah, as I said, you got to be careful with Job, but we've given 2 or 3 different possibilities of what it might mean here. But the important thing is it was a rhetorical question, which God was asking a lot of rhetorical questions to Job, and the obvious answer is, well, no, you can't. No, you
no
can't.
human being
no,
can.
You don't know.
Right, exactly. But I think in terms of, it also reminded me, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 25, where that passage where Paul says, God's foolishness is wiser than men, and his weakness is stronger than men, because you mentioned in the book, and I don't, again, a loose connection, I don't know, because it's Job's language is unique, that the word for Orion that is translated in English in Orion means fool. It's Casil or Kessel. Mm-hmm. And so when you look up at the constellation of Orion, God is using the name, obviously that something was familiar to Job, because Job uses the same term in Job 9:9. There's something foolish about Orion. And every myth that you read about Orion, it's not behavior that you want to emulate. Whatever the culture's myths are, it's a bad thing if you're going to be, he's chasing after women, he's boastful, he's a braggart, he's a hunter. But I did find it interesting that, in the Orion myth, he's holding a lion, at least in our Greco-Roman astronomy pictures. And I think you have the picture there on page 34, where he's holding a lion's pelt. And that's what made me think of Samson when he killed the lion and then tried to do a riddle with his wife. But he was a braggart. He was a strong man. He had problems with women. In all the myths, there's some similarities there to Samson. And so it doesn't seem to be, if you look up at the constellation, it seems to remind every culture that there's something nefarious and foolish going on with this particular figure in the sky, isn't there? Yep,
you're right.
We don't want to emulate. So it's interesting because you also mentioned the gospel and the stars. And so we don't want to say here that God intended Orion to mean X, Y, or Z, because he doesn't tell us what he intended it to mean. When we're dealing with constellation myths, we're dealing with the stories that we tell as human beings.
Yep.
And so God certainly purposed them for signs and for seasons. But we're projecting our own human experience onto the stars. But I would say that to say that there's probably some historicity in some capacity to the stories behind Orion, would you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The constellations, their origins are steeped in mystery and a lot of different weird things. Nobody really knows where they came from, who made them up, and what the whole purpose was. It's been translated and transliterated so many times, it's horribly garbled.
There's a conglomerate of myth and speculation about what they are. So we want to be careful that, especially as Christians, not to say that God intended this to mean this or God intended this to mean that. Obviously, he's probably in Job speaking to what Job knows, not necessarily what God intended for these constellations to mean. So we got to be careful when we do our exegetics and making these connections. But back to the visual aspect of these things. Orion, Taurus, and the Pleiades are all together. I used to think the Pleiades were the Little Dipper. I mean, when you look at it, it looks like a little scoop or a little shopping basket with your naked eye. And then right next to it is the V of Taurus.
That's a common misconception, very common misconception people have.
Yeah. In fact, the Little Dipper is actually harder to see than the Pleiades is. A
lot harder.
Yeah,
particularly where you live.
Right. Well, even in dark skies, it's really hard to see if you don't know where you're looking. But it's not.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about the difference between a star cluster like the Pleiades and a constellation, because we have the asterism constellation distinction. Let's talk a little bit about what a constellation is and what an asterism is and how that fits into the Hyades and the Pleiades and Taurus and all that.
A star cluster is a gravitationally bound group of stars that are held together, and they are relatively small appearing in the sky. You know how small the Pleiades appears. Mm-hmm. Probably one of the largest clusters to see is the Hyades. It's a short distance away. It's the face of Taurus. Mm-hmm. And it's a little clump of stars as well. But most clusters are much, much smaller appearing because they're farther away from us than either of those. They would not be recognized as constellations per se. But constellations are just little star figures people put together. We've generally recognized and codified 88 of those encompassing the entire sky. And some of them resemble what they're supposed to be, but most of them are pretty dreadful, actually trying to figure out what was going on there.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we'll take pieces of a constellation, or maybe pieces of a couple of constellations, and put together sort of a mini constellation, what we call an asterism. The Big Dipper is a good example, and the Little Dipper. Both of those are sub pieces of the Big Bear and the Little Bear. There's the Teapot, one of my wife's favorites. It's an asterism that's part of the constellation Sagittarius. It really does look like a teapot.
Right, that's becoming visible now in this time of year in the southern hemisphere, the southern part of the skies. It comes up.
It would be more of a summer constellation for us. It's starting to emerge in the morning sky. So that's behind the sun for the most part now.
Yeah.
But the another one would be the summer triangle. Deneb, Altair, and Vega make up the summer triangle. There are three different constellations represented there. They represent an asterism as well. So these are more modern, recent origin things, and things that help us identify groups of stars. I gave you several examples there, but they're not official groups of constellations.
Yeah. And so in a truly technical term, the International Astronomical Union has set aside what I think you said 88. Is that correct?
88. Yeah.
And they're kind of, so they're like cities or counties really of the sky. You have 88 divisions of the sky, and the main star shape is like the county seat of the constellations, and so we say constellations.
You could view it that way, I guess.
Yeah, it's the way it's helped me to look at that.
The entire sky has been, if you will, the real estate of the entire sky has been divvied up that way, so there will be no more constellations. Right. There are actually 48 constellations handed down to us from the ancient Greeks to Claudius Ptolemy nearly 2,000 years ago, and those cover what you can see roughly north of latitude 34 degrees or so, back several thousand years ago. So there are vast regions of the southern part of the sky we don't normally see that were unremarked upon by the ancient Greeks. Yeah. And so a lot of those were created, the constellations there were created in the last 400 years. Astronomers went down there and began identifying new constellations of their own. And it was a mess to try to sort those out. It was not really codified until 1930, I think, when the IAU actually set it up, and they killed some old constellations. They even tore apart one of Ptolemy's constellations into three pieces.
Wow.
Well, and most of them are still Ptolemaic.
Ptolemy's took from what was pre-existing in his day. So he's what, second century AD, and he went back to in his Almagest. These things just appear, so they must have pre-existed Ptolemy. Going all the way back to Babylon, correct? The Babylonians?
Oh, even earlier than that. Many people, he did a star catalog of over 1,000 entries, and many scholars today believe, historians believe, that he actually took Hipparchus's star catalog. Hipparchus was like 2nd century BC, and just updated that. We do know that Hipparchus had a star catalog. We don't have a copy of it, though, and there were other star catalogs before that, though not as detailed. However, you can do some interesting sleuthing. There's an effect called precession, where the precession of the equinoxes, where the stars' positions slowly change over a 26,000 year cycle. The most obvious shift is in the pole star. Right now, Polaris is close to the North Celestial Pole, but it wasn't like that until about 400 years ago. And in the future, it won't be. Say 2,000 years ago, there was no pole star, no North Star. And people long ago, probably in the 1800s, took the Ptolemaic constellations, applied precession to it, and they were able to figure out roughly where and when the constellations that Ptolemy gave us were deduced. The where is around 35 degrees north latitude, give or take a degree or two. And the time is very interesting. It's about the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Give or take a couple hundred years.
Wow.
So it predates Ptolemy by more than 2,500 years, which would suggest that they've been around a lot longer than anybody could have imagined. How it's preserved is another question.
Wow.
But I find it fascinating that time period and that location really coincide well with the immediate post-flood society recorded in Genesis. The time and the location is the plain of Shinar is we know where that is. That's 34 degrees or so, 35 degrees north, and the time frame's about right. So it would seem to me that once the Tower of Babel was built, the constellations are already codified, and people carried those
stories
traditions with them around the world, and that would explain why there are similarities or differences, but similarities. For instance, many cultures saw in Ursa Major, Big Dipper, if you will, a large bear, and a small bear and a little dipper. And I can see the big bear. The little bear is a little harder for me to see. But the perplexing thing is they both have long tails, which bears don't have long tails today.
Right.
They just have a little stub outside of my fist. They've got tails, but not much of a tail. And I don't think there's any evidence that there ever were long-tailed bears. And you could say, well, people in Northern Europe, the Celts, the Germans, were kind of related, connected to Babylon, the same continental landmass. So there's some cultural contamination going on. That's fine, but how do you explain many North American tribes having two bears in the sky?
That's right.
And everywhere you go, people had these weird stories about how the bears get their long tails. So they recognized it was a problem. And so why did they all see bears? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that they saw it because of a connection. Now, if you believe in the evolutionary time scheme, the Native Americans, their ancestors arrived here 10,000 or more years ago, long before the constellations were codified.
Yeah.
But if you believe in the biblical time frame, it perfectly fits. I mean, it's amazing how well that fits. So we got kind of an evidence here. The biblical chronology, I think, is correct.
Yeah. I mean, we just did a podcast on flood stories not too long ago about the similarities among the Americans, going all the way up to Canada, through North America, Central America, Mexico, and South America. That how do you explain indigenous cultures that had no communicative connection with one another? How do you explain the similarities in their myth? And if you go back to Babel, and you go back to human beings spreading out, taking their stories with them in different languages, it makes perfect sense why you would have Native Americans all across the North American, South American board having similar stories. Wayne and I have speculated, and it's something similar to what you just described, that post-flood, why would we have bears in the north? I mean, I don't finally know, but certainly, what do we find in the Arctic, Danny? I mean, that's the wonderful thing that polar bears are in the Arctic, right? You have Arcturus, which if you speed to Spica, or you arc to Arcturus, how does that little limerick go?
You arc to Arcturus and spin off to Spica.
Yeah, and if you come off the tail, quote unquote, the tail of Ursa Major, you go to Arcturus, which means bear watcher, and then in the Antarctic, which means no bear. So you have
the name Arctic was given by the Greeks, and the Greek word for Arctic is bears, Arctic.
Right.
And they apparently they associated bears with the far north. Now, why, I don't know, but I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
Did they know about polar bears at one time?
Well, and I wonder, and this is just my pure speculation, I wonder, Noah and his family gets off the boat and they watch the animals go. I mean, I don't know what that was like, the redistribution of animal population in the earth. They watched the animals leave, I guess, the ark, and maybe bears went north. Who knows? But you're right, Danny. The similarities in these tales. I mean, if you go from Japan, if you go to the Orient, or you find the other thing that is fascinating, and I didn't notice if you had pictures of it or not, but Draco. I mean, why do all of these cultures have a dragon story and a circumpolar serpent-like creature that is hostile to mankind? I mean, it's fascinating. You have Cetus and you have Draco, and you have the water snake, and you have the Ophiuchus, who is a serpent handler. You have this idea of a serpentine reptile creature-like thing that lives in the sea that is hostile to mankind. And I find this to be fascinating as well, that we have this. Why would there be a serpentine opposition to human existence in our constellation stories? And it seems very biblical in some sense that this is a reflection to some degree that there is a real spiritual and perhaps physical enemy that cultures of all times and pasts had known about.
Yep. I didn't do Draco in the book because that's a difficult constellation to pick out.
Yeah, even if you know where it is, it's even in a dark sky.
Oh yeah.
Even in a dark sky, I have to find the triangle head, and then even if you
Yeah.
find the triangle head, it's really hard to trace the serpent's body.
One.
It's really hard. So it's visually it's not easy to photograph. Star clusters are one of my favorite things to look at in the telescope. I absolutely love it. You have a picture on page 38 and 39. Glen has taken these pictures, Glen Fountain. This just looks like a luminous cotton ball at first glance. But tell our listeners and viewers what we're seeing here. This is M13, a designation of the Messier catalog, or the New Galactic Catalog. The new, what's the NGC? New Galactic...
New General Catalog.
New General Catalog. These are scientific nomenclature, but visually, what are we looking at here, Danny? This is fascinating. I mean, I know what
photographs
it is,
of M3 and M13,
Yes.
and these are what we call globular clusters. And the thing is with globular clusters that we call them that because they have a globe sort of appearance.
Mm-hmm.
If you pick the book up and you look at any one of these and you spin the picture around, it doesn't matter which way you look at it, it looks the same because a globe or a ball, if you spin a circle, if you spin it, it has the same orientation.
Yeah.
Now, the other type of cluster is called an open cluster. The Pleiades is an example of that. And on the previous page, on page 27, there are 3 photographs of open clusters. And there are several differences between the two. Number one is that globular clusters are grand. They hold tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of stars. Open clusters, only a few hundred to maybe a few thousand, so they're not nearly as rich as globular clusters. The other huge difference is the lack of symmetry. If you take a picture of the Pleiades or these three open clusters on page 37, you turn the book upside down, they look very different because they don't have that symmetry, that radial symmetry to it.
Yeah.
So I truly love globular clusters. When I'm showing people things through the telescope here at the observatory at the Creation Museum, I like to show them a globular cluster. M3 and M13 are some of the 2 of the best choices.
Yeah.
Because with some of the telescopes we have, you not only capture that glow of all those stars, but you can pick out a few individual stars with your naked eye.
Yes.
Sort of like what the photographs look here. Not quite as bright, but they're fantastic,
now,
beautiful things.
To give people a perspective of what we're looking at here, contrast. So it just looks like a blob of light. But what this really is, each of these stars, many of them are probably much more massive and in size than our sun, and our sun is pretty big. I mean, but comparatively speaking, what is it? 109 Earths can go across the diameter of our sun.
Right.
So these are clusters of stars that are enormous.
It turns out the density of stars are pretty tight in there. When you get down to the core of these things, the stars are probably only fractions of a light year across, apart from one another. Only recently discovered binary stars in these things because the stars are so closely packed. Binaries tend to get ripped apart.
Okay.
But if the sun were inside of a globular cluster, there would be so many bright stars. These are giant stars, the ones you're actually seeing, the brighter ones, that it would be like living in a major city, even when you go in the countryside. And we would have no knowledge of galaxies out beyond us because they would be too faint to be seen.
Oh, wow.
If we were to live inside of a globular cluster. Wow. So the density there is quite large, and some fascinating things going on there. But these are mostly giant stars you're seeing, the bright ones.
Now, would these stars be, I would imagine by what you're saying, that would these stars still host planets even though they're so densely packed together?
That's debated. I think they found a few planets now, but and these things. But the problem is that because the density of stars is so great in globular clusters, the stars often interact with one another, come close, and that would have a tendency to gravitationally affect any planets that you have. It's a good thing we're not living in a globular cluster, because not only would deep space astronomy be impossible, but there would be a good chance that a star would pass through your solar system from time to time and wreak havoc upon the orbits of planets. It's not a place you want to go looking for.
No. Which is further testimony to the fact that we are in a unique situation here in our own solar system. And I know you know Guillermo Gonzalez. Guillermo has his book the Privileged Planet, and he talks about the position of our Earth within our galaxy. enables us to see a large percentage of the rest of the universe. If we were in a dense field of stars or enlightened hydrogen illuminated gas or something like that, we couldn't see anything. It would be like light pollution in the cities, as you said. Further testimony that God put us here, I think, and intended us to see things. Let's move out away from these clusters of stars. Let's talk large scale here. Andromeda is our nearest neighbor. Set up what a galaxy is, because this is fascinating to me. I mean, I know what a galaxy is, but it's fascinating that we didn't know what these things really were in the last 100 years. This was 1920s when Edwin Hubble put the Mount Wilson 100-inch Hooker telescope to these things and ended the debate between him and Shapley. Harlow Shapley thought these things were clouds in our own Milky Way. And Edwin Hubble said, no, Shapley. And he wrote Shapley a letter. I love this. He wrote Shapley a letter when he discovered the variable, the Cepheid in Andromeda. And he says, hey, Harlow, guess what I found? Andromeda is a galaxy, and Harlow is said to have said, here is the letter that destroyed my universe. So Hubble wins the debate. Here's the 100-inch Hooker telescope, Hubble's discovery. And then he was showing the photographic plates shortly after his discovery to an English poet who came to visit him. Her name was Edith Sitwell. And he showed Edith the pictures, and he told her what these were. And her response was, how terrifying. So really, this is a phenomenal thing that I think is so underappreciated in astronomy. Just in the last 100 years, we've realized exponentially how enormous our universe is because of what Hubble discovered about galaxies. So, Danny, what is a galaxy? Why is this fascinating?
A galaxy is a collection of a few 100 billion stars orbiting around a common center of mass. It's much bigger than a star cluster. In fact, you would find star clusters within a galaxy. As you said, our own galaxy is the Milky Way, named so because of that bright fuzz of light that goes completely around the sky. In the northern hemisphere in our summer, it's the best, brightest part to see. People in the southern hemisphere get a better view, though, however. But you're right, in 1924, Hubble was able to show in one fell swoop that the biggest and brightest of the so-called spiral nebulae, what they were calling them then, thought they were gas clouds that were solar systems in the forming. He showed that it was actually a distant, actually a nearby, but it's still a distant group of stars. And by implication, all the others were as well. And you're also correct that the universe got suddenly very big. Up to that point, astronomers generally thought the Milky Way was the universe, the galaxy, the universe used synonymously. There were people going back to the 1700s that were saying, well, maybe these things are just what we call island universes, other galaxies like ours, beyond ours.
Right.
But that was speculation and not really taken seriously, particularly by the end of the 1800s. And I've wondered about this. So why didn't it have a bigger philosophical impact upon life? I think maybe general relativity had already done that a few years before, and published in 1915 and confirmed pretty quickly. That had a huge impact psychologically and philosophically with people, and maybe they were just shell shocked at that point. But to me, that's huge. The universe suddenly becoming far larger than you could ever imagine. It's like you spend your entire life in a house, and then you venture out one to the state. Now there's a state, there's a nation. Not only is there a nation, there's a whole planet of other things out there you never knew about. Right. That is the kind of thing. Kind of think back, was about 50 years ago, they discovered a tribe, a small tribe living, I think, in the Philippines, and they were the last reached people. And they thought they were the only people in the world. They had no idea anybody existed outside of them. And what a real change in worldview that must have had.
Right. Well, I think it was Immanuel Kant who suggested the island universe idea, and then
around 1750. You're right.
Yeah. And then I think it's interesting, Danny, because I think this exponential increase in size of our galaxy has led to the conclusion of secularists who study the universe to conclude that we're so small, we're insignificant. I mean, you hear that mantra, that rhetoric all the time. We know how big the universe is, and look at our planet and our pale blue dot. Carl Sagan, of course, popularizes this in the 1980s. And so
Harlow Shapley, you already mentioned, he played a role in this too.
Yeah. So this idea that, and I think it's a non sequitur, It's simply the argument that because we're small and because the galaxy is so enormous, that we must be insignificant. But you can see from our last couple of years of dealing with COVID that something that is small isn't necessarily insignificant. But that I think philosophically you touched on this, that there was an implication, a sort of a backfire effect. Now cosmologists and astronomers who can crunch the numbers and do the math are telling the general population who aren't so sophisticatedly knowledgeable about physics and science and cosmology, hey, you guys, you know what? We did the math, we have our telescopes, we do the science. We're small, and therefore we're insignificant. And then the further conclusion with that atheists and skeptics take this is that there must not be a God, because why would God create all this space if it was all for us? Which is another misinterpretation of what the universe is for. Because yes, He designed it to be inhabited, but it's not all about us. Right? It's about what you say in the book, the glory of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. And so I think you would agree that discovering the expanse, discovering the exponential size increase in our universe attests more to the glory of God.
Well, this reminds me of David in Psalm 8, raising this question about our ultimate place and meaning and purpose of the universe. He comments how insignificant man seems to be in the scheme of things, and God, why do you even care about us? And this is the kind of question that's been asked many, many times. You mentioned Carl Sagan. He raised the same sort of question in one of his, I think this may have been his last book that he published, Pale Blue Dot, talking about the fragility of the Earth, and that little incredible photograph from the Voyager probe showing the Earth as a pale blue dot, 2 pixels in that thing.
Yeah.
And same sort of question David was asking, with much higher powered sorts of arguments today, I guess, with space travel and space photography and so forth. David didn't do too badly sitting in the Judean hills, probably 2,000 or 3,000 feet above sea level in a Mediterranean climate. I'm sure he had a lot of time at night.
Beautiful dark skies. Yeah.
Beautiful dark skies. And he used his own 2 little photometers he had called eyeballs to look at things. He raised the same sort of question. And, this whole thing, if you look at it from an atheistic world or agnostic worldview, it's very depressing, because the universe is very big. The universe does not care about you. There's no purpose. There's no meaning in life. We're born, we live, we die, and that's the end of us.
And the universe wants to kill us, right?
That's basically
deadly.
it.
Yeah.
And and Carl Sagan wrote that book as a series of essays trying to find purpose and meaning in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think he failed miserably, because he approached it from an agnostic viewpoint. There is no God, so there is no purpose, there is no meaning, but I'm going to try to find purpose and meaning. Mm-hmm. And his argument basically was, we've accomplished a lot of cool things, art, music, and literature. Wouldn't it be a shame if we destroyed it with nuclear war and now climate change? And my response would be, well, who cares?
What's the point?
The evolution is driven by extinction. Our time is coming. And when we're gone, nobody's going to shed a tear. So why are you shedding a tear now prematurely? We'll be gone one day, and that's the end of it. Yeah. That's really a super depressing approach. But David answered that question very effectively. He had a 2-point answer. First answer was the fact that we were created just a little lower than the heavenly beings, but we're crowned with glory and honor. And this gets back to Genesis 1:1, where we're created in the image of God and in His likeness. There's something God-like about us, and that gives us a special status in creation above anything else that's ever made out there.
Right.
And I think whole dissertations and books have been written on what this means. I think a large part of it is our social ability, our interactions, the fact that we can talk with one another. We have a need for companionship and interaction. We're social creatures. We're designed that way, and animals aren't like that at all. And obviously Adam could see that didn't fulfill it. The other part of his answer was based on dominion. We were given charge of things, going back to the Garden of Eden. We're in charge of this planet. We can use the resources that are here, but we ought to use them wisely. So it's not a matter of conserving everything for whatever purpose in the future, or just using them all up right now. No, it is a careful balance, and Christians really need to take that careful balance of using resources wisely. Mm-hmm. So I love David's answer. It runs circles around Carl Sagan's answer, because it's based in creation, it's based in Genesis. Mm. And apart from that, we have no purpose, we have no meaning. Yeah. And I think that's the whole answer to the fact that the universe is big, and I think it's an advertisement of God's power and glory that goes Psalm 19, Romans 1, 19 and 20, so that men are without excuse. There is a creator who's very powerful.
Right.
But on top of that, God deigned to consider us very important. We
Right.
are the center of his attention.
Right.
And he desperately wants to have a relationship with us.
Well, and the other thing, Danny, too, that this touches on is not just meaning and purpose, but ultimately, and as you know in your experience, every time you discourse at length with anybody about the universe, the big questions always surface. David's question is systemic to our entire existence as human beings. Why am I here? What is all this? Is there a reason? Is there a purpose? Is there a God? I mean, even in the most erudite secular cosmologists and atheist philosophers, when they talk about the cosmos, God always comes up. It's unavoidable that his name, his character, it is counterintuitive, really, to deny. You really have to work really hard to try to put together arguments for God's non-existence from the universe. And all of the propositions I've seen, or the arguments that we've talked to some of the best atheist philosophers on our Atheist and Christian book club. I've interacted with Lawrence Krauss on our book club. I've read a lot of cosmology. God always comes up, and the reasons for why God might not exist, it's just an exercise, it seems like, as you say, in futility, to try to continually argue for God's non-existence, because the more people argue for God's non-existence, I think the more that demonstrates exactly what David says, that as you look at the universe, you are looking at a declaration of God's glory. And one of the other things, and we talked about this at the beginning of the talk, is the beauty of the universe. And now that because of telescopes, as you say in the book, Jim and Glen and anybody else with a telescope today, we can see things and take pictures of things that astronomers couldn't do in the last century. So the technology for the layman has improved, tenfold, hundredfold in magnitude. But let's talk about the beauty of some of these galaxies as we're still talking about galaxies. You have on page 19 a picture from Glen of M33, which it just looks like a rose garden to me. It's somewhat of a spiral, kind of a spiral. There are different structures that I think Hubble came up with a classification for basic galaxy structures. But this just looks like a rose garden to me. You have these beautiful rose-like colored gems along the faint spiraling arms there. And it just comment a little bit about what's going on in this picture. It's just beautiful. I mean, it's just sheer beautiful.
This is a spiral galaxy. It's loosely wound spiral arms. M33 is kind of close to us, a bit farther away than Andromeda, and it's a little harder to see because intrinsically it's fainter. It's a little farther out, and it's also turns so we're looking nearly face on to the disk of the galaxy rather than edge on, like with the Andromeda galaxy. And those red glows you see, those are what we call H2 regions. Those are emission regions. The Orion Nebula is an example of an H2 region. They're powered by hot, bright stars. So when you see those, you're seeing firing up H2 regions big time. And for some reason, they really show up in the Triangulum galaxy more than the others. This was a difficult one to see. I've seen it a couple of times, but its surface brightness is so faint that it doesn't show up. It photographs reasonably well, but its surface brightness makes it difficult to appreciate with the eye.
Do you know how long Glen had to do exposures to get that stunning imagery there? I mean, he must have
probably an hour or so, I'm going to guess.
Gotcha.
And then, the way you do that is you take a bunch of short images and you stack them. It works better than just taking a long exposure.
Gotcha. And on page 16 and 17. Jim and Glen have photographed Andromeda, which is our nearest neighbor. Now, in a dark sky, if you know Pegasus and the constellations, you can trail out and find Andromeda with your naked eye if you're in the dark sky. This is what I like to do when I find Pegasus and I'm out near a dark sky. I'd like to go, oh, yeah, there's Andromeda. It's fun to see that. But this is our nearest neighbor, right, in terms of a galaxy. One of the
any size,
of any size.
Small galaxies, they're
Mm-hmm. And it's probably astronomers think it's moving toward us. Is that correct? That's actually one of the few galaxies. We're on a collision course. I keep hearing this over and over again. But
Not for any length of time yet.
not in our lifetime. But what's going on in Andromeda? This is a classic spiral?
It is, and it's a large one. It's a little larger than our own galaxy. And as I said, it's a classic spiral. It's nearly edge on. You can see, particularly on that inset photograph on page 17, some of the dust lanes in the spiral arms. You can also see two satellite galaxies in either image.
Mm-hmm.
You can, at the center, you can see the nucleus of the galaxy, and then on either side are these little satellite galaxies. They're little elliptical galaxies. They orbit around. That's pretty common to find satellite galaxies. Our own Milky Way has two satellite galaxies, but according to Faulkner's rule observing number one, you can't see it from this latitude. You got to go to the southern hemisphere to see it.
Okay.
They're called the large and small Magellanic Clouds, and they're actually quite impressive. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they look they look like pieces of the Milky Way that you kind of plucked out and threw off into space.
Oh, wow.
They're really impressive. God put all the good stuff in the southern hemisphere. You need to go to, say, Chile sometime to the dark side.
I would love to.
Stunned.
I would love to. I've heard so much wonderful things about it. On page 20 and 21, we have a couple of more galaxies. These are beautiful. Now, it's funny. You tell the story a little bit about Charles Messier, who his friends and contemporaries in his time period, 18th century, called him the comet ferret. I don't know if that was an epithet attached to him contemporaneously or if that was later, but he was on the hunt for comets. And of course, he had limited telescope capabilities back in the 1800s. But Messier was a detailed observer of the sky, and I can picture him in his French accent going, "That is not a comet." And so he would write it down on the list. He'd see a fuzzball in the sky, and he'd write it down on the list. "That is not moving. That is not a comet. Ignore it." So he made this. He ended up making about 100 or so, a list of 100 or so objects to avoid if you're comet hunting, because these were fuzzy nebulae that he couldn't focus very well on his telescope. So these just look like fuzz, and we just want to ignore it. But what he ended up doing was cataloging some of the most beautiful and iconic entities in our universe. These are nebulae and galaxy, and now we know that the Messier list, anything designated with an M, is a target. You don't want to avoid it. You actually want to go look at it, because these things are stunning.
It's ironic, isn't it, that he didn't like these things?
That's right. To pay no attention to the fuzz in the sky.
And yet he's known for this. That's what's funny about it.
Yeah. Please avoid them. But now there's Messier marathons. I'm sure you've done it. I haven't done one yet. But what is it? Late spring, where you got to catch them all. Yeah,
there's an interval of like a week with no moon that you can do it. I've never tried it, but you can try to get all 100 or so of them in one night. Yeah.
It's a cooperative effort.
1 or 2 nights you can do it.
Right. The other galaxy that I wanted to mention, and this is beautiful, the one on page 24, the one on page 24 and 25, Messier 51. It looks like what I call the father and son galaxy. It looks like a giant father spiraling, whirling galaxy attached to what I think would be an elliptical galaxy. It is off the tail of the Big Dipper, I think, off the handle of the Big Dipper, is it not? It's called the Whirlpool. How big is this thing? What's going on with the Whirlpool here?
Well, it's just a very grand spiral. It's got very, very detailed spiral arms, nearly face on. I believe this may have been the first galaxy that spiral structure was clearly visibly seen through it with this for photography. But I think Lord Ross may have been the one who saw that with the Leviathan telescope very clearly. But it's not that far away. It's about the size of the Milky Way, probably. It's a good sized galaxy as well. And it's got that companion off the end of one of the spiral arms.
Wow. Well, and the other fascinating thing that you mentioned in the book is we're going through the galaxies here in the first part of the book. Glen has photographed, and this is just one, galaxy clusters. So if 110,000 light year galaxy, if the enormity of galaxies don't blow your mind, how about galaxies clustering together? Wayne and I have talked about these things, that they are, some of these structures, Danny, are indicative, they're too big they don't fit into the Big Bang cosmology, because they're in early parts of the universe where, if you take the secular paradigm, there's not enough time for these things to form and cluster together in the superstructures that they are. They've discovered a multitude of structures that are enormous. But they've also discovered things in the universe like the great void in beauteous, the shepherd. There's no galaxies in terms of where they think there should be a multitude of galaxies. So these clusters are amazing too. Clusters of these enormous structures as well. And Glen has, I think it's Glen. Yeah, Glen has documented these clusters in the Hercules cluster. What's going on when galaxies cluster together? Is this like star clusters only on a galactic scale? Same kind of thing.
That's basically it. Yeah, there's a hierarchical structure. I think clusters were discovered in the 1930s, right after Hubble realized what was going on. Then people, the Hercules cluster was one that's found early on. The Coma cluster was another one. There's a guy named George A. Bell who in the late 50s did a dissertation where he was doing studies of clusters, probably one of the first systemized study of all of these things. I remember reading Fred Hoyle back 50 years ago more, where he was suggesting that it was just, clusters of clusters of clusters of clusters of clusters clumping ever higher structure throughout the universe. At the time, most people kind of dismissed it, but it's about 40 years ago they began to discover voids and began to discover sheets. And now what we understand is that you end up with clusters of thousands of galaxies. And keep in mind, each galaxy contains a few 100 billion stars. So you got a lot of material here, but you got a cluster here. And then there'll be a cluster nearby and another cluster nearby. And those clusters are kind of arranged in big sheets or in bubbles. And you get this filamentary structure. And in between those sheets or bubbles, you find very few galaxies. They're not totally empty, but there's not many there at all. And that seems to kind of get back to Hoyle's suggestion of a long time ago of this hierarchical structure. And it's now believed that this hierarchical structure goes all the way up to the largest scale of things. At one time, they used to assume that it would smooth out on the big scale. I don't think they think that anymore. But on top of that, as you mentioned, some of these structures are so big that you don't have enough time within a Big Bang cosmogony to explain how those structures developed. And I don't do extragalactic astronomy, but to me, one of the most fascinating things is this hierarchical structure and the sheets and so forth. Nobody saw that coming. That was a big surprise 4 decades ago when that began tumbling out.
One of the fascinating things that you mentioned is something about our sun that I actually never considered. That if Big Bang cosmology is true and we're dealing with billions of years, talk about the sun paradox. What's a problem? Where is evidence with our sun that it's probably not 4.5 billion years old? What's your perspective on that?
That's called the young faint sun paradox. We have very elaborate theories in astrophysics to explain where stars get their energy. And there's actually evidence to support this. It's fusion of hydrogen into helium in the cores of stars. For instance, over the past half century, we've detected neutrinos coming from those reactions. There was a bit of mystery there for a number of years, but it's now been resolved, where we have very good evidence now. We know what kind of processes are powering the sun, and this would power the sun for 8 or 10 billion years. So far, so good. However, with time, the consumption of hydrogen fuel results in a buildup of helium ash, as it were, a byproduct in the cores of stars. And that, without getting too much into the physics of this, you're doing a net reduction in the number of particles involved. And that changes the molecular weight. If you know anything about the ideal gas law, that then changes the pressure, volume, and temperature. The upshot being that as the sun ages, any star ages, the core of the star will tend to contract and get hotter and denser. That will tend to drive the reaction rates up faster. They're very sensitive to temperature. So with time, we would expect the energy production of the sun and other stars throughout their lifetimes to increase. And we can calculate pretty accurately what that would be. And so it turns out that if you go back 3.5 billion years ago, when life supposedly developed on the Earth, the sun was only a billion years old or so. The sun would have been significantly fainter back then, about 30% fainter than it is today, 25 or 30% fainter. If you run the numbers, and I've run the numbers, you find if you change nothing else, then the overall temperature of the Earth's surface temperature would have been about 17 Celsius lower than it is now.
Wow.
And the average temperature on the Earth today is 15 Celsius. So that's -2, which in real temperature is like 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be the average temperature of the Earth. The polar regions would be much colder. And since the average temperature would be below freezing, that would have resulted probably in an ice ball planet. Kind of reminds me of the planet in the second Star Wars movie, totally iced over.
Yeah.
And the situation from which the Earth never could have recovered because of the albedo effect, reflecting of sunlight off of the ice and snow. Well, nobody believes that. I mean, conventional geologists and biologists think the average temperature of the Earth over the past 3.5 billion years has fluctuated a little bit, but not changed significantly. So they've called this the faint young sun paradox, and I've known about it for 40 years. And in the past 40 years, I've seen 3 or 4 different definitive explanations that were supposed to solve this problem. If that's the case, then why did you need another one to replace the one that was already definitive, you see? And most of them focus in on a changing amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, with a lot of greenhouse gases to start with. And then as time went forward, the greenhouse gases diminished and so forth. So it exactly compensated. And what you end up believing is that you have 2 unrelated events, one taking place in the sun, one taking place in the Earth, 2 unrelated with no feedback mechanism whatsoever, exactly compensating one another for 3.5 billion years. I find that remarkable.
Yeah.
That anybody can believe that actually is plausible to have happened.
So that is.
And but if the world is only thousands of years old, there's no problem, because over a few thousand years, the sun's total output hasn't changed much.
Right. So that's a good argument for a much younger universe, I would think. But speaking of that, the biggest problem, and maybe we can wrap up here. I you don't have to speak to it exhaustively, but it is a paradox in some sense of this light time travel problem, because it seems to be that we do have light distances kind of nailed down. You don't land things on Mars if you don't know how far away it is, and we seem to be this idea of how much distance is between us is measured by light. So if there's really billions of years between the most distant stars and galaxies and us, for a young Earth perspective, what is the current thinking on this paradox? How do we explain distances and time in relation to a young universe? What's your perspective?
Well, we call this the light travel time problem. There have been several different proposed solutions. I've got my own. I'll share that with you. I'll let other people put theirs forward. First of all, I want to point out that the light year is not a unit of time, it's a unit of distance. And presumably the 2 are related, but you got to keep that in mind. They're 2 very different concepts. I believe that much about the creation week was miraculous and very quick. I think God used a lot of process. We find on day 6, God made man from the dust of the earth. That was a pretty fast process, but it still was a process. We find that on day 6, the land animals came up out of the ground. I didn't see that for the longest time. It's repeated in chapter 2, and it brings in the birds from day 5 as well. It talks about the waters on day 5 giving rise to life, swimming things, aquatic creatures. But really, dry land appears. And then it started talking about the plants coming up out of the ground. And there are two different verbs used in verses 11 and 12, 2 Hebrew verbs that have overlapping meanings, caught my attention when I looked them up. And the impression I get is that from the meanings of those words, that God caused the plants to grow up rapidly out of the ground, sort of like a time-lapse video of a plant, which can be anywhere from weeks to years, depending on what kind of plant it is.
Yeah.
And the reason why God did that is he needed to mature those plants to provide food for man and beast a couple of days later. If they would have grown normally, then everybody would have starved to death pretty quickly. So I think what God did, I propose that on day 4, when he created the stars, he performed a miracle. Not only did he create those objects, but he also rapidly brought forth that light to fulfill their purposes, because there were several purposes given to the heavenly bodies, and if they would not have been visible, at least by the end of creation week, if not by the end of day 4, then they could not fulfill their functions any more than the plants could have fulfilled their functions if they were not mature. So I think God rapidly matured the creation during that time. Some of my creation science brethren, they don't like my answer because it's a miraculous sort of thing. They're looking for physical, natural explanations in terms of general relativity and such. But my complaint with that is, can you give me an example of anything else in the creation week which was natural or physical? I'm looking at it and I can't see anything that's natural. You get life from non-life, you get light where none existed, you get matter and energy where none existed. Again and again and again, the miracle of creation violates everything we understand about how the world works today.
Absolutely.
So why should the light travel time probably be any different?
Right. Well, and even the contemporary secular physicists and cosmologists who study Big Bang and cosmogony and origins, you hear the often repeated phrase that the laws of physics break down, our current knowledge laws of physics break down at what they call the singularity. So even if you have contemporary physicists and scientists who have no vested interest necessarily in the God question, are basically saying, yeah, the laws that we know today were violated or weren't in effect or break down. And it's almost a concession of a naturalist miracle that there's something extra above and beyond, or something that we haven't discovered, or something that we don't know. It ends up being a naturalism of the gaps in some sense. That it meaning go either way. You can say, well, let's not bring God in until we've ruled out all the naturalistic possibilities. But that's saying, like, well, let's try to figure out all the ways in which a car could assemble itself without invoking engineers and design of the automobile. They're two different legitimate questions. You can still have a technical explanation, but you can also have a personal explanation. You can say God did this and not have all the mechanisms. I was talking to a friend of mine at church recently about because on our show Wayne and I try to get the best minds in both Young and Earth camps, and we try to give an open and ecumenical view for Christians to have thoughtful dialogue with each other about this age question. And so we try to be as open as possible. But I was dialoguing with a friend of mine, telling him I was talking to some Young Earth geologists, and we talked to Hugh Ross to sort of balance that out. And anyway, I got into the discussion about the very thing that you're talking about. And I said, well, what about the wine in Cana? I haven't heard of anybody trying to adduce a scientific explanation for how Jesus actually, the physical mechanism of how water turned into wine almost instantaneously. And when the master of the feast tasted the wine, what he knew about wine, he knew that was good wine. But knowing that it was good wine, if you were to ask him, sir, how old is this wine, do you think? What's he going to say? I mean, his knowledge of wine is that it takes time for good wine to develop. He's not going to tell you that happened instantly. He's not going to tell you that wine came about with a command, right? And I think my friend didn't like that. He's like, "Oh, that's not good." And I said, "Well, it is. It addresses the problem. it addresses the problem you're talking about. We're not talking about a universe, So
keep in mind that the Big Bang has a light travel time problem too. It's called the horizon problem.
Right.
They've been solving that with inflation for a long time, even though there's not a bit of evidence that inflation ever happened.
There's no inflaton. Nobody's found an inflaton particle. Nobody's found an inflation field. Alan Guth in the 1980s came up with this idea. It seems, in all due respect to Alan, who's a brilliant mind, I think even he's conceded it's a little ad hoc. I mean, it does explain things, but it explains things in a naturalism of the gap. But there's no physical evidence for anything of this actually happening, and it is one of the most sticking problems in cosmology and cosmogony. You and I and Wayne talked last time we talked about this idea of the cosmic microwave background radiation. That's the linchpin for Big Bang cosmology. Look, we predicted this, and look, we found it. This most distant, faint light. But there were so many things that they didn't predict. They got the temperature wrong. They got the uniform. Nobody expected it to be uniform. And certainly this seems, at least, this is a field of study. I would be fascinated. We need more research on what this background radiation really is, because biblically, I think you could make a case, and this is just what we discussed, it's kind of hypothetical, but biblically you could make a case that maybe what this is is the separation of the waters from the waters, and then we have the expanse. And what we're looking at is maybe temperature reflection of some kind of water that God has separated from the rest of the universe. And the expanse is all the stuff we've been talking about, galaxies, stars, nebulae, planets, and all that stuff.
That's been my position now for several years. It's radiation from that water above separated on day 2.
Yeah, I think that's a something worth exploring. But now if you put that out there in modern physics, people will you're going to be like Copernicus, Danny, writing letters. People are going to laugh at me. People are going to make fun of me. I don't want to propose a solar-centric universe. I don't want to, but that's how science advances, I think. You propose something. It's not necessarily popular. You study it and look into it. But Danny, thank you so much for your efforts and what you do. It's a beautiful book, The Heavens, A Different View. Jim and Glen and you have put together a masterpiece, definitely something that you don't have to be a scientist to know that. I appreciate the very down-to-earth vernacular you guys used in putting this together, and how you've integrated good science, thought-provoking science, and Scripture, that the ultimate meaning and purpose for why the universe exists is not ultimately for us, but for the glory of God. So beautiful work, Danny, and continue on in your mission in bringing the knowledge of the glory of God to people. It's fantastic. Final thoughts here.
It's been a delight to be with you once again. It's been a very comfortable interview. I'm pleased with the book. I hope other people will enjoy it too. It's one of those things, it's like National Geographic. If you want to, just look at the pictures, but the essays aren't that long either.
Yeah. And you have Scripture throughout and good sound theological reasons. Whether you are young Earth or old Earth, this is an excellent book to have. And, as Wayne and I strive to do, we want to, and I know you do this, and you do it in the book, and I think you do it well, that there's a lot of antagonism between believers. It's an in-house fight in this age question, but I think we need to continue to be ecumenical and as kind and as gracious to one another as we uncover the mysteries of the universe. I want your final thoughts on what you think the James Webb Space Telescope is going to show us.
I have no idea, but every time we build the next big telescope, it surprises us. They built the 100-inch telescope to replace the 60-inch. They built the 200-inch to replace the 100-inch. They go step by step by step, and every time you do this, you find things you would have never imagined.
That's right.
I'm expecting much, but I have no idea what it's going to be.
Well, that's an excellent point, Danny. Thank you for sharing that, because I think every telescope that has been built has been a paradigm shift, more or less. I think it's safe to say, has changed our perspective of the universe, and has really altered our perspective on the heavens. So this one, I think we're going to be untying a lot of Gordian knots and maybe creating more.
That's the way it always works. You answer several questions, you come up with 20 more.
Right, right. Well, Hubble in the 90s, after the astronauts fixed the camera and all that stuff, Bob Williams decides to point Hubble at a blank spot of sky, and lo and behold, 3,000 galaxies. Later on, in the early 2000s, another blank spot of sky, and bang, 10,000 galaxies in a blank spot of sky. And so Webb is going to blow minds, I think. The glory of God will be revealed even more. It's exciting to be alive at this time and to see things that no one has ever seen before in the history of humankind. It's amazing. Thank you, Dr. Faulkner. I appreciate your work and your effort and everything you do. Blessings on your endeavors.
Thank you.
We hope you have enjoyed this special broadcast today with astronomer Dr. Danny Faulkner of Answers in Genesis, and we hope this has helped and encouraged you in your faith, to remind you that God is faithful, that the Lord Jesus, who created, numbered, and named all the stars, has created you and knows you and loves you. You can find details about how to get a copy of Danny's latest book, The Heavens, A Different View, in the notes below, as well as a link to our own book, The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God. For Good Heavens and Watchman Fellowship, I'm Daniel Ray. Soli Deo Gloria.
Good Heavens is recorded and produced by Watchman Fellowship Incorporated. For more information about our podcast and ministry, including having our staff speak at your church, visit watchman.org That's watchman.org.